Hello, AmpLab listeners, and welcome to an interview episode of Tech and the Arts, a podcast of the Arts Management and Technology Lab here at Carnegie Mellon University. My name is Andrew Wolverton, and I'm the Technology and Interactive Manager. Today's episode features last year's podcast producer, Angela Johnson, and Professor Kirk Savage from the University of Pittsburgh. Stay tuned for an insight on historical monuments in our society and new ways to think about how we honor our heroes.
Hi, I'm Kirk Savage. I'm a professor of art history across the bridge at the University of Pittsburgh, and have been there for about 30 years and have spent most of my professional life writing about public monuments.
I am curious, you've written a lot about public monuments and especially Civil War monuments, and I'm curious how you got into this subject. It's definitely an important issue, but sometimes it feels like a lot of people didn't really care that much about this subject until like this year. So how are you like ahead of the curve? How'd you get into this?
Yeah, well, I'd gotten interested in public monuments in a strange way, actually. It was on a summer abroad study while I was in college, and I had a professor in London who took us around and was really interested in public monuments. And that sort of got me the bug. And I didn't go to graduate school until several years later. And I wanted to pursue my work in public monuments then. And the reason that I thought of Civil War monuments there were a couple of reasons. One is that it was precisely because nobody was interested in them and writing about them. So I thought, it's really interesting to go into a field where you sort of feel like you have it to yourself, because nobody else is interested in it. And as opposed to, say, working on Rembrandt or, some famous artist where there's already a lot of contention and controversy and, a lot of people have weighed in. And so I liked the independence and the freedom of it, of being in a topic that was, basically poo-pooed, right, as one of any interest in. And it was also a challenge, right? So, nobody in my field was interested in it. So it was my challenge to make it interesting, right? And then I guess the second reason is, I have a family on both sides, and I have ancestors who had fought on both sides of the war. And I was just very interested in that and kind of exploring that more. When I went into the topic, initially, I really actually wasn't thinking so much about the issues of slavery and emancipation, and was only by actually getting into the topic and really confronting it that I realized that was the issue, and that was the issue I needed to take on. So, I sort of backed into that issue in a way, and then it became central to my life. It's partly as my privilege as a white person that I didn't realize when I first went into it that was, that I was going to find myself investigating in a really deep way white supremacy, and the ongoing power of white supremacy from that era to the present. Because I had grown up at a time when the Civil War was romanticized. I had my little blue and gray toy soldier set when I was a boy. And so it took my approaching the subject intellectually and academically to understand that there were really deep fundamental issues at play here that had been swept under the rug.
So you have written 2 books, correct me if I'm wrong, about Civil War monuments specifically.
Yeah, well, so what I became really interested in the ways in which monuments were or were not dealing with the major issue of the war, which was slavery, right? And so slavery had caused the war, and the war was fought over slavery. The Confederacy was a nation that was created for the sole purpose of protecting what they called Negro slavery, right? The right of white people to enslave people of African descent. And so first of all, it took some time to even understand that, because at that point the histories of the Civil War were so there was so much gaslighting still going on about that. To really, and it was only really in the late mid late 1980s that historians really began to overthrow the old ways of thinking about the Civil War, and to make slavery the central issue that it really was. So I became really interested then, and I thought, well, how are public monuments after the war dealing with what was the central issue of the war, which was slavery? And how were they dealing with the main outcome of the war, which was emancipation? How are they imagining those things? How are these monuments in the language of the time, the artistic language of the time, which was figurative sculpture? How are they, what kinds of ideas were they promoting, and messages were they giving, and so on? And so, that required a lot of sort of deep thinking and work in the archives to try to figure out, because none of that was really on the surface, So, so I became just as interested in how Union monuments were kind of failing to represent the true stakes of the war, and failing to reckon with the war's outcome. I became just as interested in that as I was in Confederate monuments, which were engaged in a process of basically historical denial that the war had anything to do with slavery. And I realized that this story took me well up into the 20th century. The initial Union monuments that dealt with the issues were in the 1860s and 70s, but then the Confederate monuments weren't erected in large numbers until the late 19th and early 20th centuries. So, and then on, these monuments became even re-energized and even more important in the 1950s and 60s, when the civil rights movement was really beginning to take off. And the centennial of the Civil War in the 1960s became another opportunity for white Southerners to double down on their kind of racist, interpretations of the war and so on. So, the story just kept going on and on, till, and when I was doing the research, in the late 80s and the early 90s, there were still Confederate monuments that were being preserved, refurbished and rededicated, even with ceremonies and so on. So, there was just beginning to be a critique of them, but at the same time, a huge amount of, resources and everything dedicated to their preservation. So it would be a long time, right, before they were seriously challenged. It really wasn't until, in the mid 2000 teens that they became seriously challenged. So just the longevity of this story is kind of amazing.
Definitely. I think that's so, I've never really thought about like what Union monuments are also lacking. And I feel like we talk a lot about the Confederacy and how they kind of change, or the way that they tell their own history, or the South tells their history of the Confederacy and like what the Civil War was about. And to be fair, that history is also told in the North a lot, but we also don't really emphasize the fact that the Union soldiers were fighting against slavery. It's a weird thing to not talk about, but yeah. And I'd also heard about Confederate monuments and how they were mostly put up in the in the 20th century, and how a lot of times to like incite fear in Black communities and that all of that, which I feel like a lot of times they have the what I like to call the Indiana Jones excuse, meaning like it belongs in a museum as opposed to just having statues out there. But a lot of times museums are like, but we don't want this because it's not really a historical object of the Civil War. If anything, it's an interesting history of racism in our country, and that in that way it could be in a museum, but not necessarily in terms of like a Civil War museum. It's not really a historical object in that way.
Yeah, well, you'll find, I mean, there are no easy answers to what to do with these monuments, because museums, are not thrilled to be taking these monuments for a number of reasons. I mean, one is that there's a cost, right? These are pretty large objects, and there's a cost to storing them and stewarding them over time. And I think these museums can rightfully ask, is it worth the cost? But there's also public relations issues, I mean, do you really want to take that on as a museum? Do you want to take on these objects with these racist histories? And, then, that's a tall order for them. And that requires them to do a lot of work and thinking and interpretation. And they've got their hands full already with other issues. So, my experience has been generally, it's really, really difficult. It's kind of only in exceptional circumstances that a museum will take, one of these problematic public statues. And for the most part, it hasn't seemed to be a solution that will work. And a lot of time, mostly when these monuments are decommissioned, removed, from public space, they are either put in storage, like the Stephen Foster Monument here in Pittsburgh, just put in storage. That's in a plywood box, in a store outside in Highland Park in a storage area, or they are sometimes relocated on private property, in a sense sold, right, and that's also very problematic, because they're sold to white supremacists, who mm-hmm. display them on their property. And, is that what we should be doing? Is that what a public entity should be doing? It's kind of like, mm-hmm. Selling Nazi memorabilia to neo-Nazis, it's just very problematic. Anyway, so there's no real easy solutions to any of this. And just to bring it back to make one more note of the problematic Union monuments, the so-called Emancipation Monument, which was on the cover of my first book. There are two replicas of it. The original is in Washington, D.C., and is very much contested right now. It's fenced up in this park called Lincoln Park on Capitol Hill. And nobody really knows what to do with it, but it's fenced up now to keep it from being attacked by protesters. And there was a replica erected in Boston that was recently taken down from a major, public square in Boston. So these monuments are not immune either, right? And they were problematic because of the representation of the Black figures represented in a really subordinate and servile kind of way. So, these issues really extend over a wide range of monuments, and it's not just Civil War monuments either. It's Columbus and it's Indian fighters, and white supremacy really permeates the monumental landscape. So, I
feel like monuments really reflect the way that in this country, especially, we're taught history with great men being commemorated for doing great things. But this is, not how the world works. And I guess I'm wondering, do you think it's damaging to our society to tell this simpler story?
Frankly, I do think the world would be better off without the hero monument. Probably, when all is said and done, we could probably get rid of all of them, and they would probably, even if the people are okay. But I think there are some, there are some hero monuments that are legitimate and effective and inspiring. But the whole idea that history is made by singular heroes is totally wrong, right? And it's not, as you said, it's not the way the world actually works. It has a lot of problems with it in that, typically when you're elevating people as heroes who really weren't heroes, right? Or at the very least, were very complicated people who may have done something heroic, but also did a lot of things that weren't. But it's also a way of kind of ignoring and downplaying the agency of so many other people, right? So if I go back as an example, this Emancipation Monument in Washington, D.C., that's a figure of Lincoln standing over a kneeling enslaved figure, Black, man who his chains have just been broken. And the real reason that is such a terrible representation is that it gives all the agency to Abraham Lincoln and doesn't give any agency to Black people who really actually who sort of forced Lincoln's hand and made him issue the Emancipation Proclamation. It didn't come out of nowhere, right? He issued that proclamation because Black people had been fleeing slavery in huge numbers and coming to the Union lines. And so they were taking their own destiny into their own hands, right? Freeing themselves at great risk. And Lincoln realized that he had a source of manpower here for the Union Army, and that this could actually tip the scales. I mean, it was a very difficult war to win. Having 200,000 Black men fighting on your side was going to, be a huge, game changer. So, so that's the problem with it. So, all those women, for example, like women women who were enslaved on plantations, who got their kids and their families together and took them and escaped and took them to Union territory. They don't have names, right? Their names are lost to the historical record or whatever. But this was, there were thousands of them, and we don't have any monuments to them. Because we want to make the great white man the person who's responsible for this, it's Abraham Lincoln. So I think that's the real problem with the hero monument, is that it really denies the agency of ordinary people, who behaved heroically to, protect themselves and their families, which has happened across history in so many ways, in so many different ways. And those are typically not honored in public monuments.
Mm-hmm. And I feel like when we perpetuate this great man idea, then that causes people to want to be great men. And
right.
That usually is not always ends the best way for the rest of us. But,
right.
But I guess I also wonder, if we did replace these figures or put up new monument, if we just put up a bunch of Harriet Tubman monuments, is that obviously that's better, but I guess I still wondering, is that still the same issue of, perpetuating this idea that there are these great people? Obviously there are people who do amazing things, but I don't know. Sometimes I wonder if there are better uses than monuments.
Right. Well, and so, Harriet Tubman is an interesting example. Harriet Tubman was an extraordinary figure, right? An extraordinary person, but she also, she had a posse of people who helped her, right? And that's the case with anybody, right? Anybody who's able to achieve anything, they're doing it with help, typically. And, so the Martin Luther King Memorial. Well, Martin Luther King was an extraordinary person, an extraordinary man who said and wrote extraordinary things. But he had a huge, he was one of many, many people in a movement. So, it's a very interesting and good question. And there are people come down differently on this question of whether the right response now is to just try to counterbalance all these white hero monuments with hero monuments to people of color. Versus those who just want to reject the whole idea of the monument altogether, and want new kinds of commemorative solutions. Who want temporary monuments, performances, or embedding public history into the landscape in other ways that are not conventional monuments. And this is a tension between these two. And maybe in the end, they aren't mutually exclusive, right? I mean, it's maybe the answer is to do both, but not to put all your resources, certainly, in conventional figurative monuments. But the reason for putting some resources in that area is that, I think regular people who walk around and see statuary, they want to see themselves represented in that statuary. So as long as that statuary is still up, as long as there are any monuments like hero monuments up, they will want to see themselves represented for very good reasons. So I'm not sure what the answer is. I just don't. I know the answer is not just to keep erecting more hero monuments. we got to be doing it.
Yeah. I feel like right now everyone's so focused on tearing down problematic statues that we're not thinking so much about what we do next. I guess.
Right. But meanwhile, in a place like Washington, there are all kinds of groups that are ponying up, trying to get congressional resolutions to build monuments. It happens all the time, every year. And, there's a group that is probably going to get a resolution passed to erect a monument to the so-called global war on terror, which would be Iraq, Afghanistan, et cetera, veterans. And there's all kinds of other monuments, all kinds of smaller special interest groups that come in, to try to get their own monuments erected. But you're right in the sense that, as we talk about what to do with the white supremacist landscape and how do we respond to that or change it, or I think we're a long way away from having any sense of where that's going to go. There are organizations like Monument Lab. I'm on the board of that, which are really actively dealing with that issue. And so I think I'm really encouraged with, that there are people like Monument Lab, really interesting people, diverse group of people coming together to address this question and to work on it in a lot of different ways. So, I think we'll begin to see some, but I think it's going to take a long time for solutions to start to emerge.
Definitely. It's it's a long-term thing to try to find a solution to long-term problems, I guess.
Yeah, I mean, and this gets to an interesting question. I mean, especially for your listeners in arts management, about what really the role of the arts is in society and in promoting really urgent goals like, racial justice. And I still, feel very strongly that the arts do play an important role in helping, in bringing issues to attention and also creating or opening up the imagination to new solutions. I think this is where the memorial landscape could actually do some real good if we unleashed that kind of creativity there and stopped thinking about permanence and started thinking about the possibilities of creativity and imagination. So that was one reason I got so interested in these early Union monuments that dealt with slavery, because I thought, well, here was this moment. It was kind of a brief moment, like the moment we're in right now, where there's a moment of possibility of like real profound change that could happen in society. And that we were in one of those moments after the Civil War, and it did lead to, the adoption of the 14th and 15th Amendments, which have been really so important in the history of this country in providing a foundation, at least for, later for the civil rights movement and so on. But there was this moment when we needed to imagine what an emancipated world would look like. And it was possible, theoretically, it was possible for monuments to help imagine this, but they couldn't do it, right? Because they were stuck, because the artists, the white artists who were getting the commissions and so on, they were stuck in old ways of thinking. And so that was a kind of tragedy. That was a tragedy, really, that we could not imagine a genuinely emancipated interracial world that, we were trying to create it with policy in the late 1860s, civil rights legislation and so on, and that's great. But those policy changes ultimately failed, right? They failed miserably. And, my argument was that we also needed imagination. We needed to be able to reimagine a society that was going to be a genuinely emancipated interracial society, and we couldn't do it. And the white powers that be couldn't do it. So I do think that in this moment that we're in right now, we have a similar opportunity where I think imagination is really important. What is this new world going to look like? How can we inspire people to create this new world? One of the ways you inspire people is by giving them some vision of it,
That's really beautiful. I think that's a good, hopeful place to end this. But thank you so much for talking. Where can people find you?
I'm happy to have anyone email me at ksa@pitt.edu. And if you forget that, I'm very easily found on the Pitt website. So I'm happy to engage in conversations with people. I really like to hear from perspectives of people, unlike myself, particularly, or, people who come from other fields and backgrounds and so on. So I'm happy to start up a conversation over email.
That was our former podcast producer, Angela Johnson. And if you would like to reach out to our guest, Kirk Savage, you can find his contact info on the University of Pittsburgh website. And listeners, did you notice something different? We're trying out new music for our podcast. Let us know what you think at amt-lab.org. This is Tech in the Arts, the podcast of the Arts Management and Technology Lab. Thanks again for listening to the Tech in the Arts podcast. If you found this episode informative, educational, inspirational, or even just interesting, then share this episode with another arts and tech aficionado in your life. And send us an email to ampedlabcmu@gmail.com with your questions or ideas for content. If you want more research and perspectives, visit our website at amt-lab.org. We'll see you for the next episode.